project of the California Coalition Against Sexual Assault, sponsored by the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. The views and information provided in this web conference do not necessarily represent the official views of the United States government, the CDC, or CALCASA. Today's topic is harmful gender norms. How do we build alliances with queer LGBTQ movements to help prevent sexual and domestic violence? To me, this is such an important topic. As a parent of a trans child, I have been going through my own learning process and looking at how the work that we need to do and have that impact, and seeing my child who's in college going through the orientation around sexual violence, and she was raising questions of, but how does this speak to me? And so it's an important piece that we need to think about, and I think there's opportunities when we look to change our gender norms, that the work with queer communities is so vital to the work that we're trying to be able to do to create healthy and safe communities. So with this, I'm really pleased. Today's objectives are we're going to hope to engage in a candid conversation with the necessity of engaging directly with LGBTQ community members at decision-making tables to enhance our prevention efforts, share real-world examples of alignment with LGBTQ movements and identities as a necessary component to countering the harmful aspects of gender norms that lead to sexual and domestic violence, and for everyone to be able to identify tools and resources to support alliances with queer community movements and sexual and domestic violence prevention efforts. I do want to think about the pronouns here, and I know I haven't introduced our guests yet, but I might ask our guests to join in. Pronouns are something that we use in our language, and they often replace a person's name when talking to that person in a third person. They're not really preferred because it's sort of a shortcut that we have, and it's not really a debate about it, but it is something that we've sort of created. And pronouns imply something about gender. They don't declare what someone's gender identity is. So I think it's important for all of us to be able to be explicit about what pronouns we want to use to identify for ourselves. I myself use he, him, and his, but we know that everyone here has their own. And so I'm going to ask each of the speakers to be able to introduce themselves with what pronouns they do, and I want to get from our audience of how we are doing this. So what pronouns do you go by? So go ahead in the text chat. Talk about what pronouns are most comfortable that you want to use, and we'll just want to see the range that we can have, and that that there's a full range of different types of pronouns that different people use, and it's important to honor those pronouns. So I see many of them, you know, she, her, hers. I see they and them. I see a full range, and it's great. She, her, hers, they, them, theirs, and that many people use a range of pronouns, and that we can be able to capture doing that. And I do see that some people have more than one person. Someone said they don't have preferred pronouns, but we want to be able to honor that, and it's part of the intentionality about approaching this work. So I want to thank all of you for sharing and sort of setting the tone that we want to be able to do in doing this work. So with that, I'm really pleased to be able to introduce our host for today, and I'm really Maisha Williams, who is Prevention Institute. Hi, Maisha. Why don't you tell us what your pronouns are?
Hey, David. Thank you. I go by she, her, and hers. Thanks for asking.
Great. Well, that's a beautiful picture. What a great background that you have there. Great. Well, I'm going to hand the podium over to you now. So actually, Ashley's going to hand the podium over to you because I don't have that ability, and I'll come in a little bit. But I'm really pleased that Maisha is with Prevention Institute. Prevent Connect and Prevention Institute have been working together for 11 years, and now as Maisha, who's been working on this project for a little while now, is taking the role of the host of our web conferences, so I'm really honored to have you here with us. So thank you, Maisha, and you've got the podium.
Thanks, David. As David said, I am with Prevention Institute. I'm a program coordinator here. I'm really happy to be on this session with you all today, and actually really excited to be a part of this season of Prevent Connect web conferences. So I want to introduce someone who is a core component, part of our team, our Prevent Connect team here at Prevention Institute. Her name is Casey Castaldi, and we really wouldn't be able to put these web conferences together without her. Casey, did you want to say hi?
Hi, everybody. I'm glad to be here again for my second season.
Great. So today's discussion is really going to sort of center around three main parts, right? So we have the first part, we're going to really talk about engagement directly with LGBT communities. The second part is going to be around aligning efforts to counter harmful gender norms in our prevention work. And then finally, we'll end with some tools and resources to help us work better together. So let's get started with the first part of our conversation. And it's really around ensuring that prevention efforts that we work on in our practice reflects the diversity of a community, and is to me a fundamental part of really a commitment to health equity. And so this is a quote by America who says that community participation, when it's real, is your main investment in accountability. It's your main investment in sustainability, and community participation is when truly you involve people in creating a mechanisms for themselves to define change. So we all know that community engagement is essential to the effective prevention work that we're all working on. So let's get it started. We want to know from you what kind of activities you're currently using in your prevention work. So we want to hear from you what ways do you interact and engage the LGBT communities, the usual stuff as well as sort of the unusual, more creative, out-of-the-box strategies that you're using.
Great, so go ahead and write in the text chat. We'd just love to hear what types of ways have you been engaging? And it'd be great to talk about some of those partners that we have going over to see. Liz talks about critical media literacy education and making sure there's representation of LGBT communities and people. Safe zone workshops, Elizabeth talks about. And if you have questions about clarification, just go ahead and put in the chat. Ben talks about listening from lesbian women and learning from Suzanne Farr and homophobia, a weapon of sexism. Consent workshops. Now people are writing in, so it gets harder to run through and read all of them. Setting up booths at local pride events. Working with high school gay-straight alliance groups. Diversified staff and participation in Pride, I'm seeing that. Creating safe spaces at the agency. Collaboration with youth in LGBT spaces. Media analysis with young group. And break down gender, sexuality, sexual orientation, and gender identity. We'll be talking about that. Okay, so actually their organization has a LGBTQ plus violence prevention health educator who does prevention education and advocacy for students. And so expanding confidential services to LGBT students affairs professionals and presenting to colleges. I did a lot of college themed doing work in there. Changed all bathrooms to all genders in the health center. And that's another college example. We'll be talking about that as we look at organizational change later on. So Maisha, I'm seeing a wide range of engagement, and it looks like we have an audience that has been really thinking, I know, has been thinking about this, and want to acknowledge that I live in a rural level and having trouble doing anything, and that's an issue. And there's some questions about how do we start engaging with elementary and middle school, and so there's also questions that are coming up with that we see. So Maisha, a lot of engagement that we see. Why don't you talk about some of the types of engagement that that we could be seeing?
Yeah. So. These are some of the sort of strategies that have come up in our work here at Prevention Institute. So you have ongoing meetings, community forums, interviews, community-based participatory research is something that I'm really particularly fond of and love to engage communities around. We do community mapping. This is a great way to engage especially younger people. Photo voice is a great strategy. We have resident participation on commissions, boards, and councils. So these sort of reflect a lot of what you all spoke to in your responses, but also a few others. So with that said, we should move along and get into our discussion. And I'm excited and really anxious to sort of introduce the two guests that we have joining us for this conversation. Today we have Lolan Sevilla and Liat Wexler. Lolin is a queer butch community organizer and cultural worker with over a decade of cross-sectoral nonprofit administrative development, event coordination, and programmatic experience. They have worked on a range of issues, including social and economic justice for LGBTQ communities of color, gender justice, child sexual abuse, and intimate partner violence. Currently, Lolin works as a training coordinator for the New York City Anti-Violence Project, where they are responsible for researching, writing, and producing training curricula. Liat is the training specialist at Center for Community Solutions and has more than 13 years of experience as a facilitator. Since 1999, they have focused on ending domestic violence and sexual assault through direct services, fundraising, board leadership, and prevention education. At CCS, Liat provides professional development and crisis intervention training and specializes in the neurobiology of trauma, resilience skills, motivational interviewing, and violence within the LGBTIQ, polyamorous, and BDSM communities. They co-founded Genderqueer San Diego in 2011 and have helped organize Trans Pride in San Diego since its inception. So welcome to you both, and thank you so much for joining us.
Glad to be here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Great. So many of you know, and those of you who have joined Prevent Connect before know, and those of you who are joining us for the first time will sort of find out, and as David said, that Prevent Connect is really a learning community. So this is a safe space to think through intersecting issues related to preventing sexual and domestic violence. So these conversations that we have on Prevent Connect aren't one-size-fits-all conversations. And in my experience, what has really been helpful in laying the groundwork for working better together is to have a shared understanding around language and terminology. So in order to make sure that we are all on the same page and sort of all fully able to participate in today's conversation, we're going to talk briefly about some terminology that we need to know moving into this discussion. So I'm going to hand it over to Lolin to sort of talk us through some important terms for us to know for this conversation today.
So wonderful. Thank you, everybody, for being on this call. It's actually been really heartening looking at everyone's strategies and how they're engaging with meaningful outreach to LGBTQ communities and being LGBTQ inclusive. We're going to start with, and it seems as if folks are already engaging in the work, so please excuse the going over the base acronym and just trying to get on same page of terminology. So right now we're looking at the standard acronym LGBTQ communities, and stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer. What's important to know is that all these definitions and labels don't mean the same things to all people. And if there's one thing I could impart onto everybody around issues of gender identity is that it really is personal and to the person. So actually with our community members about how they choose to identify. But for the sake of doing this work and being on this training, we're going to refer to LGBTQ, lesbian, a very basic understanding, or two women identified individuals being attracted to sexually, mentally, spiritually to one another. Gay can either be used as an umbrella term or it can be used to refer to two male-identified individuals who are attracted to each other physically, spiritually, mentally. Bisexual is a term that traditionally refers to individuals who can be attracted to either gender identity, but if we're moving away from a gender binary, a term that a lot of folks are embracing now is pansexual, which recognizes gender identity and sexual identity along a spectrum. We also have transgender, which we'll go into more in-depthly, go into more, there'll be a slide for that. And then queer, which is also an umbrella term. The two can actually stand in for queer or questioning. And something to know about queer is that it is had once been a derogatory term, but is being embraced more and more by individuals to reclaim it as an empowering umbrella term for those who don't necessarily identify within a standard acronym. You can move to the next slide. So sex and gender, is there a difference? We're going to be talking about this distinction between sex and gender and the assumptions that society makes based on these two categories. So why is this important? There are limited traditional ideas about sex and gender. We have high levels of violence and discrimination happening to LGBTQ individuals who do not follow traditional gender roles. And most homophobic, transphobic attitudes stem from assumptions around gender and sex. Knowing this will increase your ability to assist LGBTQ survivors of violence. So, okay, traditional definitions of sex. And I use that, I'm using air quotes, you can't see me, but I think it's helpful in order to move away from the gender to sort of try and at least come to a base understanding of how sex and gender identity are being used within a traditional context. So sex is defined according to the World Health Organization as the biological and physiological characteristics that define men and women. So what makes up our sex? We traditionally look at primary sex characteristics. Penis, the testes, the vagina, uterus, ovaries, chromosomes most influence primary sex characteristics and hormones. We often rely on secondary sex characteristics to help us figure out if someone is male or female. So we look at facial hair or height, body mass, vocal range. And so this is traditionally how folks walk in the world and identify individuals that they come into contact with. So gender, what is it? It refers to the roles, behaviors, activities, and characteristics that society considers appropriate for men and women. Again, it's very, very traditional as defined by the World Health Organization. And so some examples of traditional gender roles and behaviors, if we're looking at, what is masculine, traditionally it's attributed as strong and aggressive, little to no emotion showing, wearing, masculine clothing, jeans, pants, suits. For feminine, you're looking at what is soft and gentle, emotional, nurturing. For careers, you look at nurses or teachers, advocates. Next slide. Gender identities. This is unique to every individual. A person's internal and lived understanding of their gender. A person's gender identity may not always match the sex they were assigned at birth. And the term that is used when assigned sex does not match a person's gender identity. That is what we know as transgender. So it's important to note that this is still about self-identification, and that sexual orientation and gender identity often get conflated with one another, but are actually separate. So with sexual orientation, we're looking at who you are romantically, sexually, and or spiritually attracted to. In terms of gender identity, it's about how you understand your own gender and how you express that. For an example, is sometimes trans folks are labeled as gay, but a transgender person might identify as straight, or might identify as queer, might identify as pansexual. So this is where it becomes important to have conversations with the individuals that you are in community with, who may be visiting your group or organization or accessing your services.
Lowen?
Yes.
You know, there's a great conversation going on. I think about the definitions, and there's a question that's coming up of terms like intersex and other languages that we don't use. And I think that it might be worth just talking about the evolving nature of some of our definitions. And there was also people raising other definitions around bisexual, and to recognize that there's a wide range of cultural context. And so we might, you know, traditional within dominant culture is one thing than traditional within some other indigenous cultures that actually embrace some of these, have much more fluidity and don't necessarily use those same values. So it's one of those discussion that we have all the time in these discussions of how hard it is to find the list of how to be able to define them, and how do you approach dealing with that?
I mean, I think one of the wonderful things that I really appreciate about my work in the LGBTQ community is that identity is not in a vacuum, right? Like, these are sort of base approaches to beginning to start the conversation around identity. But you could have a room of 100 people and have 100 different self-identifications around gender identity and sexual orientation. Sometimes this is really hard for folks who do work in a more mainstream context to be able to embrace. And this is where it actually requires us to really move outside of the gender binary, to move outside of black and white, to begin thinking critically about how complex identities are in this U.S. first world context, and then how all that can be, you know, completely and often is very different in other countries, in other contexts, in other communities within the U.S. So, I mean, I think it's where we go into really having those conversations with the communities, organizations, and alliances we're a part of to understand what's relevant for the particular communities that we're engaging with, but that nothing is static in this work. And I find it actually really exciting and liberating, and also understand that it can be frustrating and frustrating for someone who's engaging in this process for the first time, or really trying to look for, you know, X, Y, Z, A, B, C definitions for how to approach work. And you know, I think, yeah, I'll stop right there.
Okay, well, great. And we just want to honor the conversation. The conversation that's going on this side is great, and we want to be. I want to derail where we're going for the rest of it, but I really just appreciate the great way that we're doing it. I know Liat has been doing, and then I will go ahead. So I just think I'll pass it back to you.
Great, thanks, David. This has been an amazing conversation, both in the chat, text chat, as well as, you know, Lolan's sort of description. And I think just like this conversation and all of Prevent Connect sessions, it's not one size fits all. We're doing our best to work through these issues and to be as inclusive as we can, and also we know that we have a lot to learn together. So thank you, Lolan, for talking us through that. I think next we'll talk specifically about some harmful gender norms, right? And so we really want to highlight why sexual and domestic violence prevention advocates and LGBTQ community members and movements have a shared investment in countering harmful gender norms to work toward all of our collective safety and liberation. So what does harmful gender norms have to do with it? So most of you who've been a part of our sessions before have seen some of these images. And for me, what comes up around these images is really the notion that we have to be one or the other of whatever, right? So it's an either or type of situation. So here you cannot, you can't be pretty and smart. And here, the hyper masculinity that exists in our culture says that you cannot be strong and sensitive. And here the expectation is that you have to be a feminine person who identifies as a woman or a masculine person who identifies as a man in order to choose which restroom you want to go to. So Liat, do you have, I know that you do some work around this, and Lolan do as well, so I just want to give Liat a chance to chime in if you have anything specifically to say about this image and what this image has to do with harmful gender norms.
Lolan, why don't you go first, because I think this one was yours.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think one of the at the forefront conversations right now, and I know with the communities that I work with, is just around restroom. And there's a lot of legislation, there's a lot of policing that happens to LGBTQ community members for doing something as basic as using a bathroom that reflects their gender identity, and oftentimes being met with resistance, with hate, with violence, just for doing something that everyone does. And as we've seen across the country, there's it's a really contentious debate about I'm just consistently surprised how backwards our society is when it comes to the conversation around bathrooms and single gender bathrooms, and who can and cannot use that, and who ends up policing it. And so this image is actually getting to the heart of what trans and gender nonconforming individuals have to experience every time they have to use the restroom. And I know a lot of people who just will not engage with public restrooms at all, and will wait until they get to the safety of their homes or get to a safe space to be able to use the restrooms, and how that actually causes a lot of physical harm with individuals.
Thank you, Lolan. Liat, what does harmful gender norms have to do with sexual and domestic violence and prevention?
Well, I mean, there's a ton of examples, and so I'll go through some that I use when I give trainings. Let's take a basic one, that manhood in and of itself, masculinity, is about not being feminine, right? So what is that? How does that end up translating into the queer communities, queer and trans communities? One translation is that gay men aren't real men, and therefore they aren't violent, and that the abuse is not as dangerous when it's in gay relationships. Or another one might be that men don't desire committed emotional relationships because they're naturally less emotive. So then this ultimately impacts gay men who, think that it must be easier then for me to leave an abusive relationship because it shouldn't be as committed. Or for the outside community to think that it's much easier for gay men to walk away because they're not as emotionally invested or as in love as heterosexual people. On the flip side, the idea that women automatically want more emotional commitment There's the old the U-Haul joke around lesbians moving in with each other immediately on the first date. And so this has a huge impact on whether or not queer women feel that they have access to safety and can move in and out of relationships that are abusive. Another good example that I use a lot, and this ends up translating to a lot of different impacts, the norm is that men are naturally aggressive. So where does that lead us? Well, one way is that all gay relationships are abusive, and therefore gay men deserve abuse. But that's sort of inherent. This also impacts trans men. So the idea that some trans men who are abusive will blame testosterone for their abusive behavior. We often talk about trans people as being only survivors in abusive relationships. However, that's not true. As much as it would be nice to sort of, wash away trans people as abusers, that's not actually the case. Another way that this leads and impacts the queer communities is that the idea that all gay sex is rough as a result of men being naturally aggressive, or that all gay men are using drugs or poppers during sex, and so that leads to pressure and coercion. The idea that the stronger, larger, or more butch person is the abuser. Again, that connects back to this very core idea of what men are or are not, and what women are or are not, and ignores people of other genders. Another way that this translates is that if there's no man in the relationship, then there must not be abuse. And so this really ignores not only abuse in gay men's communities, in queer women's communities, but sort of just across the board, we're missing the core definition of abuse, which has nothing to do with men per se and has everything to do with power dynamics. And so the idea that, if two people are the same sex, that there's no inequality, and so what's happening isn't abuse, that's a huge thing that the community struggles to face. A lot of people, especially coming from sort of earlier feminist perspective, believe that, women are automatically safe and trustworthy, sort of the second wave feminist thinking, and that lesbians are clearly the safest because lesbians only want to be with women, and therefore, it's safety in every direction. And so we know it not to be true, that the numbers are staggeringly high of abuse within the lesbian community. And here, I mentioned that stronger, larger, more butch person in gay men's relationships, so that's true here too among queer women, lesbians. That the idea is if you're petite, if you're small, if you're passive looking, if you're feminine looking, then you must not be the abuser, you must be the survivor. And this comes up all the time when, cops come out to respond to a call, in the courts when folks are seeking restraining orders. Oftentimes there's mutual arrests or mutual restraining orders, which shouldn't be happening, but the result is it's coming from this, this gender norm. And this impacts trans women as well, the idea that trans women automatically are abusive because, and you all can't see me, but I'm rolling my eyes at this, because they aren't real women. And we know that trans women absolutely are women, but this idea that somehow based on the sex you were assigned at birth, you must automatically be more aggressive or that you must automatically be abusive. And then there's other ways. I mean, it impacts bi folks. So if we look at a gender norm around the idea that gender and orientation are sort of intricately linked, which they're not. I mean, they're two separate things. They have a relationship, but they're not causal. So if we look at that and that kind of concept of heteronormativity, and the concept that people are monosexual, so people are only attracted to one sex or gender naturally, then what that does is it really erases bi folks. And I noticed in the comments, and I agree, that the definition people are using for bi is really attracted to more than one gender or sex. So there's a lot of biphobic messaging around it that gets either used by people outside of the community to abuse or to sexually assault, or it's internalized within the community. So messages like bisexuality really isn't a thing, queerness isn't a thing. Bi folks are confused or greedy or hypersexual, that they're really just, gay or lesbian and they don't know that yet, or that they just haven't met the right straight partner. So it kind of, all of these attitudes, these biphobic attitudes end up impacting folks who then either use this actively or it's internalized, and it plays a role in violence against queer folks and bi folks. We see things like corrective rape of bisexual people, so that's unfortunately a huge consequence of these kinds of norms. And then the idea that there's only two genders. So when we talk about gender being inherently a binary as a norm, and we're not teaching people about the breadth of gender, then non-binary or genderqueer people or agender people or people who are bigender or people who are cyborg or stud, all of these other genders become erased, and what we're doing is we're enforcing normativity. So that happens within abusive relationships. It gets repeated within that dynamic where people might be forced to wear certain clothes that conform to a certain gender even if their own does not fit it. So there's a lot of different norms. I could go on, but those are a handful that really have a huge impact in our communities.
Thank you. Yeah, this idea of sort of harmful gender norms in the ways that, these untruths or myths can sort of help keep those in place is really an interesting concept. And also, what this brings up for me is issues around violence in LGBTQ communities and the ways that sort of the varying levels or different forms of violence are kept in place through some of these harmful gender norms. And so I came across this statistic. This is from a report Forge put out last year, and it's entitled "First Do No Harm: 8 Tips for Addressing Violence Against Trans People," and shows that, for example, 74% of trans folks who had experienced hate violence had also experienced stalking, intimate partner, dating violence, or sexual assault as an adult or a child. And so, this discussion and examples that we talked about so far, as well as this statistic, really drives home the point that, all of us who are working on sexual and domestic violence prevention, the advocacy practitioners and LGBTQ community members all have an investment in changing, these harmful gender norms for all of our sakes, really. So thank you for that, Liat. Mm-hmm. And to switch gears a bit, I'd like to acknowledge, that we've also come a long way on issues like these. And part of the reason I think we've come a long way is because we're having conversations like the one we're having right now. And so a quick look at mainstream television and media. So you have the hit series. It's an online series called Transparency. You have The New Normal, Orange is the New Black, I Am Kate. Reveals a cultural shift in visibility around LGBTQ issues that has been a long time coming, and has also really helped to shift the public discourse as well. And still, there are ways that even this kind of visibility is based on varying levels of access and privilege that speak to the need to really be engaging all aspects of community so that we can truly understand what needs are and how to approach our prevention practice in ways that don't leave anyone behind. So at this point, I'd like to focus the conversation around authentic engagement, moving beyond this notion of diversity to what it really means to be truly including LGBT communities, and talks about specific aspects of community engagement as it relates to preventing sexual and domestic violence. So to help us, understand the importance of engagement with LGBT communities, Lolan, can you talk a bit about what comes up for you when you think about the impacts of not engaging LGBT communities in our prevention work?
I come from a community organizing background that really believes in centering the lives of most marginalized of our communities. So for organizing in the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, questioning communities of color, that oftentimes means centering the voices of trans women of color, masculine folks, folks who engage in sex work, folks who have access to basic human rights like access to employment, housing, health care. And so how we do that is by building the leadership of folks, actually having them be the ones to lead campaigns, having them be the ones dictating the direction of our work, and really having that be a partnership, even if we're a community organization within the nonprofit structure, that you're still centering the lives and the voices of those that are most impacted. To not do that creates the possibility that we're actually our work is tokenizing, or our work isn't as impactful as it could be. I think I'll start there.
Thank you, Lillian. Liat, I'm curious about what impact this has had, sort of this marginalization of LGBT communities has had on your work, and like how that's showing up in your work.
Well, the reality is that the queer and trans communities here in San Diego, for example, where I'm working now, don't often even believe that they are subject to abuse and sexual assault. And a lot of this is super internalized, right? So we had actually a number of very public sexual assaults happen in the gay men's community in San Diego a couple of years ago, and people did speak up and wrote about it in the local newspapers. And it was staggering because the response ranged from people coming out of the woodwork saying that happened to me too, to folks denying that it even could happen, that gay men could be raped. And so the conversation that came out of it was a really challenging one. And I remember sort of joining a couple of task forces in an effort to move forward on some kind of visibility campaign. And it was hard for folks to even get to the point where we could talk about it, because we were having to do the education that this does in fact happen in our communities. And a lot of that is, just these internalized messages. So we end up getting this feedback loop, right? And I think we have the slide up where, all of the same norms, the gender norms that lead to domestic violence and sexual assault, are the very same ones that support things like homophobia, biphobia, transphobia. And then the internalization of those messages ends up, feeding into those dynamics inside of the community. So not only are, folks from outside of the community behaving with violence towards LGBTIQ folks, but then folks within the community are as well. And that tends to happen in multiple ways. So for example, the gay and lesbian community is not super supportive of the bi community, at least here in San Diego. There's a lot of biphobia, this idea that I think Lisa may have mentioned it in the chat earlier, that bi folks can't commit, that they're somehow dirty, that they're not gold star gays. We see a lot of transphobia, coming from the lesbian and gay communities. Folks, really policing people's gender in some pretty staggering ways, and this is inside of the LGBTIQ community. So we even see trans folks policing each other. And so anyone who's in the trans community has probably seen that in other places around the country as well. So these norms are really operating at multiple levels. And when we aren't paying attention to it in our prevention work, then we're not only ignoring the queer communities, we're also really contributing to the ongoing use of these harmful norms for everybody.
Thank you, Leah. You know, I'm sort of trying to follow the chat as we're having our conversation, and I see a lot of conversation around the term cis. I don't know if you have anything that you wanted to say about that.
Yeah, I was seeing that a little earlier before I got to talking. So cisgender is a term that I use because what has happened is, you know, historically trans people were othered. So it was, you know, well, we have real men or biological men, and you can't see my air quotes, but I'm making finger quotes around this, or, you know, genetic girls, GG, you know, and these terms were to kind of make the distinction between trans men or women and, you know, essentially cisgender men or women. And it's super problematic, right? I mean, trans folks are real, and they are biological, and they have genetics, and all of these things, you know, have nothing to do with one's gender. Those are someone's, you know, anatomy, biology, reproductive system that they may have been assigned correctly or incorrectly at birth. So cisgender is a term that I tend to use as a way to level the playing field. So it's a way of saying, you know, trans people are just as real as cis people. If we're going to have to talk about someone's path to their gender, if we have to describe it in our conversation, then let's make it equitable as much as possible. Let's talk about some people are trans and some people are cis, and some people are neither trans nor cis. Maybe they're non-binary or fluid in some way that does not fit within those two categories. And I think that may have been one of the arguments that someone was putting forward, this idea that cis is somehow an excluding term, or that it doesn't allow for flexibility. And I've heard other people use that or make that case. But I will say that for now, at least, it's more useful than not in terms of, at least I have found it more useful than not in terms of seeking justice in language. And it would be great for us to find new language that helps to encompass, you know, other ways that people get at gender. But the definition that I use for cisgender is someone who identifies the same way they were assigned at birth. And the definition I use broadly for transgender is someone who identifies differently than what they were assigned at birth. So when I use those definitions, I think it's relatively encompassing.
Thanks for that, Liat. I think, you know, as we move forward in our conversation, we get to sort of some real-world examples of ways that we're aligning with LGBTQ communities. It is helpful to think about some of these issues that are coming up in the chat and some of the ones that you and Nolan just spoke to. I know there's some conversation on the chat around access for trans folks to things like domestic violence shelters and whether they're safe and welcoming and whether they can even go there in the first place. And so I think these are really important issues to keep in mind as we move forward. And given that we're really concerned about preventing sexual and domestic violence, we really want to ensure that our work is helping to challenge and reshape and foster new norms that promote safety and prevent sexual and domestic violence. And so, you know, if our vision is to create a world that reflects everyone and is safe for everyone, then we really have to be creating new norms, right? And so I really think this image speaks to that vision. And Lolan, if you want to speak briefly about this image, that would be great.
Yeah, so this is actually one of my favorite poets, performance poets right now, Alok Vaid Menon, whose work is centered around gender and gender identity, and does so in just a very brilliant way. And he has a lot of they have a lot of great analysis, critical analysis around gender, which I think challenges mainstream images and mainstream media in very creative and thoughtful ways.
Okay, so to get to the issue of how exactly we do that, right? How do we create new norms? How do we challenge? How do we make sure that we're not leaving people behind in our sexual and domestic violence prevention work? really, I think engaging and allying with communities that are typically marginalized is a good way to sort of open communication that could lead to real change. So, let's talk about some examples of alignment with LGBT communities and movements to challenge harmful gender norms. We're going to hear from Lowland and Liat in a moment, but we want to hear from the audience too. Who are the key organizations in your community that are working on LGBTQ issues? Who are those folks that you are engaging with and aligning with, and who are those organizations that are really moving this issue on the ground in the communities that you work in?
So let's go ahead and please go into the text chat and just what are the organizations, and we've got the Gay Men's Domestic Violence Project and the network LARED, I do not know how to pronounce MCVAGLY, Suicide Prevention, PFLAG, LGBT Southeast Wisconsin, I'm guessing that is. And that there's a lot of different local programs and some programs at universities I'm seeing, and LGBT centers. In Our Voices in Albany, New York, Pride Center of Vermont, PFLAG. PFLAG is Parents and Friends of Lesbians and Gays, and so it's a group there just trying to get support for that. So Maisha, I'm seeing a lot of organizations, GSAs, which are gay straight alliances, though I know at my daughter's school it changed to Queer Straight Alliance, trying to figure out a language that gets broader than the narrowness of just being gay. Avail, Gender Spectrum, an organization that I actually had very fond of, feel done some really great work. Latino Equality Alliance, so it's great seeing this. We're going to have a copy of all these resources here, so if people want to be able to help find them, to be able to do it. There's a lot of different programs, Maisha, that I'm seeing that people are working with within their community and also nationally.
That's right, David. I actually can't wait to go back through this text chat and sort of pull out a lot of the resources that are coming up here. There's a few extras. I think most of these have come up in the chat already, but all of these are organizations that are working to prevent sexual and domestic violence. I think several of them have already come up in the conversation. And now I'd like to sort of talk to Liat and see, how are you challenging norms in the work that you do, Liat? What is one specific example that you can share with that community?
So I love this image. So we use something called a snowball survey, and for those of you who aren't familiar with it, or who live in places where there are no snowballs to be had, like in San Diego, we have a survey and we ask people to fill it out, and then we crumple it up into a ball, and we have them toss it around the room, and then they melt their snowballs by flattening them out. So then we can take a look and kind of have an anonymous way to share social norms data and to collect it, really. Of course, the high-tech version of this is to have those clickers that you use in the classroom, but the low-tech way that's more active and fun, especially for youth, is a snowball survey. So we have, I've done this, for example, with the Hillcrest Youth Center, the youth there, and that's the kind of LGBTQ youth center here in San Diego. And, the coordinator asked me to come in because a lot of the youth were engaging in really risky behavior, and then were also finding themselves dealing with things like sexual assault and domestic violence. And teen dating violence. And so, we came up with a set of questions, and really the way a social norms kind of effort works is by comparing what you yourself believe or would do, and then what you believe your peers are doing. So it's not actually, it's important to find out ultimately what your peers believe and are doing, because oftentimes we're basing our own behavior on false information, right? This idea that all of my peers are having sex, therefore, even though I'm not wanting to have sex right now, I'm going to go do it because that's what everybody's doing. Or everybody's drinking in high school. Well, not actually true, but it creates sort of an internal sense of I need to match my behavior to my peers. The old term for this, of course, was peer pressure. So when we look at social norms, it's actually a much more effective tool for prevention when we start correcting that information there on the spot. And so the social norm snowball survey that I did with them had them looking at things like, what do I believe about whether it's okay for, someone I'm hooking up with or dating to want to look at my phone and inspect, who I'm talking to. And then what do my peers think about that? What do I believe that my peers think about that? And, we pulled this data on the spot, and it was really fantastic. Folks, it engaged a conversation. It really had them questioning and talking and thinking about the differences in what they thought was true and what actually is true. So that's an example of a really low-tech tool to look at things like social norms, and it can be any kind of behavior, really any kind of social norm, including gender norms. And so if you're not in an LGBTQ-specific space, like I was doing this with the youth, it can be used with adults. It can be used with youth who are primarily straight or who you're assuming are primarily straight and cisgender. But it can be used to sort of challenge ideas about gender, and it's a really fun activity.
I've actually used this tool with young people when I was working with them to challenge the norms on high school campuses. So I'm really happy you brought that resource to us. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Lolan, I'm curious about an aspect of the work that you are doing that you'd like to share with us today around challenging norms.
One of the things that I do.
Excuse me, Loan. This is David. Can you just get a little farther away from your speaker? You're coming a little too loud.
How's this?
A little further.
Okay, because I'm actually pretty far away. I'm on speakerphone and I'm pretty far away from the actual.
That's better now.
Okay. Okay. So one of the things that I do with the organizations that I train is talking about how can we challenge our organizational practices to be more inclusive and LGBTQ affirming. This is a list that's by no means comprehensive, but really great sort of starting points for how your organization can begin the conversation internally. One is including language around gender identity and anti-discrimination policies. And then once you have that, actually posting them up in spaces, which I've worked with a lot of shelters who have done that and find it really helpful to refer back to policies, that this is actually a safe space, that this is an organization that doesn't tolerate any kind of hate speech or hate actions against anybody, but in particular for a lot of organizations that come to us who are having LGBTQ specific issues within their shelters, including consistent LGBTQ affirming language and images on all websites and outreach materials. One of the issues in mainstream domestic violence, sexual violence, interpersonal violence agencies is that their outreach materials just don't reflect LGBTQ communities, and then don't reflect LGBTQ people of color. And so how that actually sends a message of how accepting or affirming an organization may or may not be is half the battle, really. Including LGBTQ affirming materials in waiting rooms. So do you have, what magazines do you have there? Are they magazines that are traditionally, kind of women's beauty magazines? Like what can we get a diverse amount of materials? Having outreach materials from other LGBTQ ally groups and organizations is also a really great way. We touched upon this earlier, but creating all-gender restrooms I've been working with organizations that have really made a commitment internally to figure out how to transition to all-gender restrooms, making sure that you're hiring staff from within the LGBTQ community across the board, so through your management and your administrative offices and your programmatic staff, creating both programmatic and organizational partnership opportunities with LGBTQ-specific groups and organizations. How meaningful are the relationships that we're building with LGBTQ organizations? One of the things that has always sort of been evident, I've had the privilege of working at LGBTQ organizations, and sort of the more marginalized the community, the harder it was to really trust more mainstream organizations who are wanting to partner, right? Who just wanted to come in, and it always felt tokenizing. And so, what is the quality of relationship that you're building, and that it's actually something that's being viewed as a long-term process? So creating an LGBTQ advisory board that is self-explanatory, and adapting your intake forms to include non-binary gender and sexual identities. So really thinking about your organization, how you're interacting with the communities that you're trying to engage, and looking at it through the eyes of those community members, and really needing to get the buy-in of your entire organization and to really make this a meaningful endeavor that feels accessible to LGBTQ communities.
Yeah, I actually really love both of those examples that you both shared, because they're, concrete tool and a concrete sort of example that we can work toward in the work that we're doing right now. So I'll keep the conversation moving. Actually, what this brings up for me is, lately I've been noticing that a lot of sort of larger social justice movements are increasingly taking the lead from and centering traditionally marginalized folks and communities. So for instance, the Black Lives Matter movement centers the experience and leadership of queer people of color. And David, I'm wondering if you have seen any of these kind of efforts in the sexual and domestic violence movement.
Well, I see the conversation happening today. I wanted to highlight from a resource that's from the effort for Moved End Violence, and I've had the privilege of being part of the cohort 3 in this, and I just posted the entire text chat again. I didn't intend to do that. I was going to just do one comment. I'll post a link to it. In a guide that's called Building Movement Conversations, we talk about moving from margin to center, and I think that the comment Jeanette Page just put a really great example in there about how to avoid just having token pieces. And instead we want to do is center our work around those who have been the most marginalized, and that's a way that we can actually include all areas. And since, as opposed to centering our work around the most mainstream population, if we center our work around those who've been marginalized, we can then address the issues in a much broader way and be able to reach low-income, people of color, immigrant people, Native people, LGBTQ identified people, people who face multiple forms of oppression, and recognize how these compound each other and affect their experiences. And so I think it's important that we focus on marginalized groups and being able to think about how that is our understanding of the definition. I think it was great in the conversation I just saw around restrooms, and how in restrooms, if we start being able to just call them restrooms, as Leon had suggested, but if we start centering it around the experience about not how do we include people, but how do we structure them to work here. This is actually an architectural problem in the way that we design restrooms in this country. I've been to other countries where you just have all single stall restrooms and then have a place for people so we don't need to be making those designations. And if that's a way of recentering our work as opposed to being able to then just try to carve exceptions in here. So I do encourage you to look at this tool from Move to End Violence to be able to look at one way to have this. Of course, we're all familiar, many of us are familiar with Bell Hooks, who has a book from Margin to Center that talks about this concept in much greater depth.
Thanks, David. You know, this really speaks to the importance of, you know, really showing up for each other in our organizing and various issues. And I'm wondering if, Liat, if you all, in the work that you all are doing, if it's an intentional sort of effort to ally with campaigns and movements at a larger level, or campaigns and movements that are not strictly around sexual and domestic violence, but maybe more social justice focused.
Yeah, so it's interesting because everybody at my agency seems to be sort of either on the sly or very outwardly involved in some kind of social justice effort outside of the one that we're all part of it at work. And I love it because, we'll at our within our interagency email, sorry, I'm a little sick still. People will post about what's going on with immigration rights, or what's happening like in the trans community, what's happening in all these other different communities that we're each part of and connected to. So many of us are doing additional work on the side on our own, and then we bring that into our space and we share and we engage each other in that kind of allyship and solidarity work. And we do this both, I think, informally, which is really beautiful to have it just be a part of our culture at the agency, and also in formal ways. So we had, for example, we had an Iraqi community project that we got a grant for. One area of San Diego has an enormous Iraqi population. And so we had someone who we hired from within the community who was doing community engagement and outreach. And that's generally how we structure our programs. If we're going to be engaging with a community in particular, we're reaching out because we have someone already working within that community, already connected to it, and then we hire from within, from outside of our agency, we hire people in the communities. We do a lot of collaboration. I mean, this is sort of the hallmark of how we operate. So our collaborations both internally, interdepartmentally, but also externally. So in the LGBTQ communities, we had one of our advocates, for example, went to the local LGBT community center and collaborated with them and then with local LGBT business owners to create door signs that would hang inside of the bathroom stall and that had some information about partner abuse within the community. And then it was a collaboration so that the LGBT Community Center's logo and information was on it, as well as ours, basically saying, we stand together on this issue and we are resources for you, and they refer to us and we refer to them for other resources. And so it really it was really interesting because there was pushback from people in the community. Some of those signs were really ripped down. People got upset, I think, seeing that. But that says it's working. It says that if we're seeing resistance, there's discomfort, and we shouldn't stop. And we're trying to talk to people and figure out what's going on. What did this spark for people? We have other collaborations in the queer communities. There's a new organization called the Lesbian Wellness Project that we're looking to partner up with. San Diego Pride, we've done workshops and things at Pride, and people had mentioned Pride in the earlier part of the chat. There's a group called Out With It here in San Diego, but they're a national awareness campaign around LGBTQ partner abuse and sexual assault, and so we've been connecting with them. With the universities, SDSU, San Diego State University, they have all different kinds of Queer Student Union and Pride Center and Pride House. And so these types of collaborations really at the core are about engaging the community from the beginning rather than sort of retroactively having a program, having a plan, and then going back into folks and saying, oh, can we adjust it in some way to make it better for you? A good example of this, actually, my director, we were talking about bilingual programs in Spanish and English. And she's talking about, starting the curriculum from scratch in Spanish. Start with the research. Start with the resources that you're pulling from. Everything should start in Spanish, because if you don't, then it's not culturally competent. And that's true here as well. We really need to be starting from the very beginning with a curriculum, if we're doing prevention education, that is at its core not based on binary gender, isn't reinforcing those norms inadvertently, as often happens, and that builds in a non-tokenizing way, which happens usually because people are trying to add in things after our curriculum's been developed. But from the beginning, we start with something that was constructed in collaboration or by people who themselves are part of the community.
That's really interesting. And Rachel brought up a really interesting question about what about the organizations that are not even talking about social justice? What about, how do we align with and ally with campaigns and movements and organizations if social justice isn't sort of part of the conversation? And David gave some good advice around, moving away from what services are provided or what people can access, but really how to reach the mission, right? What is the end goal that, in order to prevent sexual and domestic violence? And so, Lowen, I just want to know for you, how is this? How do you see this issue around aligning with different movements and campaigns that are currently taking place?
I mean, it's really trying to find where the alignment is, right? I think for us, or for the work that I'm doing with the New York City Anti-Violence Project, one of the alliances that we've been involved with for a few years is Communities United for Police Reform. And really, it's a cross-section of many different organizations, youth, LGBTQ youth of color, housing groups, homeless organizations, and really coming across a lot of difference to find where our commonalities are, and it's that a lot of our communities and community members are oftentimes unfairly targeted by unfair police practices. And so that is one of the ways that we're able to begin building these relationships with organizations that may not have a natural alliance with an LGBTQ organization, but really how are we coming across our specific missions to really, again, center the lives of those community members who are most impacted by a shared issue. So that's one way, and I think it's really, it starts with building relationships with organizations and how that could look like as a lot of what Leah already pointed to, but it could just be community shared. What does your organization do? Who are the populations you serve, and how just beginning to learn about one another in that way, and then through that work, through that relationship, continued relationship, you're actually finding where are the issues that actually intersect for both our communities. So I think that's one of the ways that you can approach coalition and alliance work. But it's a lot of systems of oppression actually operate on divide and conquer tactics. So it really follows on the organizations and community members and those of us who are doing anti-violence work to really try to navigate across difference to see where it is we can become natural allies to support one another's work and create powerful relationships that can amplify our voices.
If I could just also jump in here and sort of affirm exactly what Lolan is saying and point out that without the actual relationship building, right, the one-on-one connection and care for one another, all of it is just lip service, right? So we can have an MOU and we can say we're going to show up and we're going to support each other, and we need those things too, but without the person-to-person connection that I think those of us who are community organizers sort of at a core level seem to understand, but a lot of people don't. You know, that networking isn't just about handing over your business card and taking someone else's, but it's about, you know, really understanding what the other person's about and liking them, wanting to work with them, wanting to engage with them. So without that, I think we lose a big part of this, and that's where we start to care about other people's issues that don't initially connect to ours, or at least on the surface.
Thank you for that, both of you. I think you know, we have just a few minutes left on this session, and I really want to get to some tools and resources that might help us get there, right? Help us find that common ground. So, so let's talk briefly about some of the tools and resources that haven't come up in our conversation so far. And we want to hear from you. What are some of the tools and resources to support alignment with LGBT communities, movements to challenge harmful gender norms that you know of? That I know a lot of them have already come up in the text chat. If you have any more, please share that with us. And while that's happening, I will go ahead and queue up Leon to talk about this universal model of gender. Thank you.
I don't know if your name is pronounced Fatima or Fatima, but this is what you're asking for. So the tool that I use when I talk about gender, orientation, all of that, I go through an entire sort of curriculum that I developed. But ultimately, this model, I think, takes us away from thinking about man and woman as endpoints in some sort of way, and really dispersing gender across an entire universe. And so I want to give a shout out to the other folks who were instrumental in the creation of this, and they are credited at the bottom. I will say just very briefly that the reason the other models that were mentioned in the chat that I don't support them is because there was plagiarism of trans people by someone who's not trans in order to create the model, and is being profited so from that model. This one, you know, whether you choose to use it or not, I think what we're talking about is every person's gender is unique. You know, we all have our own internal concept of what our gender is to us, and we can cluster those together. And so I imagine people in, you know, galaxies, and so one galaxy of women, and some of them are, you know, trans women, some are cisgender women, some are, you know, queer, straight, lesbian, bi. You know, some of them express their gender in varying ways, but ultimately all of these people are women. And we have another galaxy of people who are men, and similarly, you know, this covers a whole range of people who express and understand their gender in really different ways. And then there's all of these other genders or non-genders out there in the universe, and sometimes we don't have names for them yet, but we know that they exist because we can see them and because people experience them. And so, you know, in this model I list a bunch, but it's only, you know, a handful, and there's hundreds more. And so I use this as a way to get away from the idea that somehow, you know, men form an endpoint and women form an endpoint, and then everything stems from that. Because in fact, my gender, for example, is not related to men and women in any way. And so I always found it weird to find myself put on a line, kind of a linear model. It didn't ever work for me. So I hope that that's useful to people.
Okay, we are going to have to, we've only got a minute left, and I know we want to run these quickly through. That was great. You're getting a lot of love, Liat, on this. And if you look on the document, which we do have on there, it tells you how to credit it. But let's move on to, in 15 seconds, I know it's unfair.
Well, there's another tool that's been posted to Prevent Connect about how to be a trans ally, and this is a little more than the 101 that you usually see, and so people are welcome to also use this.
Great, and then we're going to move on to the next one. And then these are just some ones on Prevent Connect, some tools that we had, of some web conferences, of some podcasts about other ones, drawing from some other work from practitioners in the field like you all. So I apologize, we're going to have to run, but I want to really, Maisha, I want to really thank Maisha and the PI team, and I want to especially thank Liat and Loan for joining us, and most of all of you who are joined us for this conversation. This was a very rich conversation. We will put a copy of the text chat so you can get the content on the website. It'll take a few days to do that, but we'll get that there. And Maisha, any last words?
Yeah, thank you so much for being a part of this conversation. I thought it was fruitful, engaging, complex, and I had a great time. Thank you, Liat. Thank you, Lolan, for all of the energy and time you put into making this such a wonderful conversation.
My pleasure.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Okay, I encourage you, this is David Lee, I'm going to sign off, encourage you to sign up for our web conference on March 23rd, where we're going to tackle the challenging issues of how to overcome binary and heteronormativity in doing our prevention work. If you can advance the slide, one more slide, please. I don't have the toilet there. So thank you all for joining us. There will be an evaluation to send us. We appreciate that. And thank you for joining us on today's Prevent Connect web conference. I'll leave the text chat open for another minute, but this will conclude the audio portion of today's session.
Recording has paused.